The scream cut through the apartment like something breaking. Not the kind of noise my 6-year-old made when he was overtired or bored. This was different. High and sudden and real. I had been sorting mail in the hallway when it reached me. I moved fast, not thinking, following the sound to the kitchen doorway, where I stopped. My son Theo was crouched against the lower cabinets, knees pulled to his chest, both arms wrapped over his head. His cup of apple juice had toppled across the tile, spreading in a slow orange fan toward the baseboard. My younger sister Dana stood over him, a folded leather strap held at her side like she'd just remembered she was holding it. Across his left shoulder, already deepening in color, was a welt the width of 2 fingers. "Dana," my voice came out flat. "Give that to me." She handed it over without hesitation, which almost made it worse. No guilt, no scramble to explain. Just compliance, as if the only thing wrong was that I'd walked in. "He dumped juice on my clean floor," she said. And then he laughed. "He's 6, old enough to know better." I knelt beside Theo and gathered him into my arms. He was doing that silent crying, the kind where the body shakes but no sound comes out, which told me it wasn't the first time he'd learned that crying loudly made things worse. He pressed his face into my shoulder and held on. Dana walked out of the kitchen. Not stomping, not slamming anything. Just leaving as if she'd corrected a minor inconvenience and was done with it. The reason I had been in that apartment at all was simple, and humiliating in the way only financial collapse can be. My divorce had gutted me. 2 years of custody negotiation followed by a settlement that left me with a custody arrangement, a storage unit, and a bank account that couldn't cover a deposit anywhere I'd want to raise a child. When my mother, Gail, offered the spare bedroom in the apartment she shared with Dana, I told myself it was temporary. 6 weeks, maybe 8. Just enough time to stabilize. I had been there 11 weeks. That night, after Theo had finally fallen asleep, I sat across from my mother at the kitchen table and laid out what had happened in the plainest possible language. I described the sound I'd heard, what I'd seen when I walked in, and what the mark on Theo's shoulder looked like under the bathroom light. My mother listened with her hands folded around a mug of tea. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You always did catastrophize," she said. I told her this wasn't catastrophizing. This was a physical mark on a child's body. She sighed the way she used to sigh when I was 16 and had inconvenienced her schedule. "Dana's going through a difficult stretch. She just started that counseling position at the middle school. If you call anyone about this, you will end her career before it begins." I stared at her. "You're describing the consequences for Dana." She didn't answer. She refilled her mug. I understood then what I had always known but never let myself fully see, in this family's accounting. My mother loved Dana the way people love a good investment, carefully, protectively, with attention to returns. I was overhead. Dana brought Theo a small Lego set the next morning, smiling like a woman who'd brought flowers to a patient in a hospital she hadn't caused. He looked at it without reaching for it. That night he woke up just after 2. I heard him before I was fully conscious, small feet on the floor, then his voice at the edge of my bed. "Mommy, if I'm good all day, does Aunt Dana still get to do that?" I lay still for a second, making sure I'd heard him correct. "No," I said. "She doesn't get to do that regardless." He considered this. "How do you know?" "Because I won't let her." He climbed in beside me and fell back asleep within minutes. I lay there until the light in the room changed. By morning I had made a decision I should have made weeks earlier. I packed everything that belonged to us, which fit humiliatingly into 2 duffel bags and a plastic tote, and carried it to my car before anyone else was awake. My mother appeared on the landing as I was loading the last bag. "You're making a scene," she said. "There's no one here to watch it," I said, and got in the car. We stayed the first week at an extended stay motel near the highway. It smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, and I told Theo we were on an adventure, which he believed for about 2 days before asking when the adventure would be over. I got him enrolled in a weekday program at a community center nearby, which gave me 6 hours a day to work. I picked up remote data entry through a medical billing company, where my background in healthcare administration. I also made one appointment I'd been postponing. I had documented everything before we left, photographs of Theo's shoulder taken that night. And 2 days later, a voice recording of my mother's words at the kitchen table. I brought all of it to the County Child Protective Services office and filed a formal report. The intake worker asked careful questions. She did not seem surprised. The investigation that followed was not quiet. My mother called me 11 times in 4 days from numbers I didn't recognize. Dana sent messages that started as apologies, and when I didn't respond, shifted into something else, a careful construction of victimhood, each message nudging me toward a narrative where she was overwhelmed and remorseful, and I was withholding mercy from a struggling young woman. I forwarded each message to the caseworker without reply. The formal hearing was scheduled for a Thursday. Dana arrived in a composed gray blazer, accompanied by my mother, who sat in the gallery with her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on me like she could rearrange the outcome by force of attention. Dana's attorney presented her as an educator under stress, a first-time offender, a person who recognized she'd made a mistake and was committed to growth. Then the pediatrician testified. Then the caseworker. Then the photographs were entered into the record. Dana did not lose her composure at the moment of ruling. She sat still and straight while the hearing officer cited the evidence and issued the order, a formal finding of physical abuse, mandatory reporting to the State Educator Licensing Board, and a no-contact order protecting Theo. She lost her counseling license 6 weeks later. My mother called to tell me I had destroyed the family. No, I said. I documented what happened to my son. I didn't stay on the line long enough to hear what came after that. There are things I won't romanticize about the months that followed. Theo had nightmares. He didn't want to be left alone in any room that had a cabinet he couldn't see around. He flinched at the sound of a belt buckle on a belt loop, any belt, anyone's, until gradually, slowly, he didn't. I sat with a therapist every other Thursday and said things out loud that I had spent years learning to keep silent, and some of those sessions left me sitting in my car in the parking lot for a long time before I could drive. I found a 2-bedroom apartment with a yard small enough to mow in 20 minutes. Theo painted our address on the mailbox in uneven black numbers, the 7 backward, and I never corrected it. I was promoted to regional compliance director at the billing company 18 months after filing the initial report. It required more travel but paid enough that Theo could take the after-school science program he'd been asking about. My mother came to my office building on a Tuesday in November. I saw her through the lobby glass before she came in, smaller than I remembered, or maybe just less intimidating without the architecture of that apartment around her. I was at the front desk when she approached. "I'd like a few minutes," she said. "I have a meeting at 2, I said, which was true. She told me Dana wasn't well. That she'd lost her apartment, that the licensing revocation had followed her to every application since, that she was struggling. She said Theo deserved to know his aunt. I thought about what Theo had said the week before, when I mentioned in passing that Dana was not allowed to contact us. He had looked up from his homework and said, simply, "Good." She hurt me, and then looked back down at his worksheet. 6 years old, and already clearer on the facts than the adults who'd been protecting Dana his whole short life. I told my mother that Dana had made choices with documented consequences, and that I was not responsible for managing either. My mother's face did what it always did when she wasn't getting what she came for. It cycled quickly through disappointment. "You were always too sensitive," she said. "I know you believe that," I said. "That's part of how we got here." She left. A few months later, I received a handwritten letter from Dana. It described her current circumstances at length, expressed something resembling remorse, and closed with a line about how she had forgiven me for what I'd put her through. I read it twice to make sure I hadn't misread it. Then I wrote a single sentence on a note card and mailed it without a return address. Remorse that asks for something in return is just negotiation. What I want to tell you is that I found peace easily and all at once. But healing doesn't work that way. It works like Theo's backward 7, uneven, identifiable, and eventually yours. What I'll ask you instead is this: if the people who were supposed to protect you were also the source of the harm, and walking away meant losing everything that had been defined as home, Would you have left sooner than I did, or would you have needed the same terrible night to finally move?